Volkswagen didn't build the software, not their own engineers, not the €14 billion software division created specifically for this exact job, not the thousands of people hired in Berlin over the last 6 years to solve exactly this problem. Instead, in February 2026, Volkswagen quietly became the first major Western automaker in history to license Level 4 autonomous driving software from a Chinese company at scale, technology built by XPeng, a company that didn't even exist when Volkswagen was already selling cars in China by the millions. Back when Chinese automakers were still widely mocked in Western auto media for copying European designs badly. This isn't a small side deal buried in a quarterly filing. It's the latest chapter of a relationship that started with €700 million in cash back in 2023. And it ends with Germany's largest automaker running Chinese-built AI inside cars, wearing the VW badge on the hood. Somewhere inside Volkswagen's sprawling Wolfsburg headquarters sometime in 2024, an engineer sits in a meeting room, reviewing quarterly numbers for a division called Cariad, a name most people outside the automotive industry have never heard, and one that most people inside it have learned to say carefully, the way you talk about a problem everyone knows about, but nobody wants to be the one to bring up first in a room full of vice presidents. The spreadsheet on the projector hasn't changed color in months. Every cell that should show progress still shows red. Cariad was founded in 2020 under then-CEO Herbert Diess's with one specific ambitious goal: operating system for all 12 Volkswagen Group brands at once, eliminating the need to ever depend on outside suppliers again for the fastest-growing, most profitable part of a modern car. The strategy was, on paper, exactly correct. The entire automotive industry's value was visibly shifting from mechanical engineering toward software, and whoever controlled that software would control the future. For years, and over €14 billion later, the division had produced one of the most expensive transformation failures. In recent corporate history, the kind business schools eventually build entire case studies around numbers. Once they became public, were brutal. 2023 operating loss, roughly €2.4 billion. 2024 operating loss, roughly €2.6 billion. Combined losses across 3 years topped €7.5 billion against barely €3.5 billion in actual revenue generated, meaning Cariad spent more than double what it ever earned back year after year with no turning point in sight. The Porsche Macan Electric and the Audi Q6 e-tron both got delayed by more than a year. Early ID4 and ID5 models shipped with bugs severe enough to trigger real customer complaints and recalls the kind of first impression that follows. A brand for years. Herbert Diess eventually lost his job partly over this exact failure, and by 2025, VW Group CEO Oliver Blume stood on a stage at the Financial Times Munich Auto Summit and announced the conclusion everyone inside the company had privately known for years. Cariad would stop trying to build software from scratch and start simply integrating whatever partners could actually deliver on time, starting with Rivian at a cost of $5.8 billion, and XPeng at a fraction of that price for arguably more usable technology. Here's the part of this story that lands differently depending on how long you've been paying attention to Chinese cars, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Rewind to roughly 2010, and the dominant Western narrative about Chinese automakers wasn't admiration, it was mockery, often good-natured, but occasionally genuinely dismissive. Auto journalists built entire articles around Chinese SUVs that looked suspiciously like a Range Rover with the badges swapped. Sedans that echoed a BMW silhouette a little too closely for comfort. Compact cars accused of borrowing styling cues straight from established European designs down to specific body panel creases. The joke repeated at auto shows and in comment sections for the better part of a decade was simple and largely unchallenged. Chinese brands couldn't innovate, only imitate. Volkswagen, Mercedes, and BMW were the trendsetters. China was the copier, the follower, the punchline. 15 years later, that entire script has flipped quietly, almost without ceremony, without a single dramatic announcement marking the exact moment it happened. XPeng CEO He Xiaopeng didn't frame Volkswagen's decision as a routine business transaction when he announced it internally to his own staff. He called it the DeepSeek moment for autonomous driving. a direct, deliberate reference to the Chinese AI model that shocked Silicon Valley by matching American systems at a fraction of the development cost. A comparison he clearly intended people to notice and repeat. In his own words, for a leading global automaker to choose China's AI technology carries meaning far beyond the cooperation itself. That's not humility, and it wasn't meant to be. That's a company whose entire industry spent over a decade being mocked for imitation, now openly. Publicly framing the West's largest car maker as the one following its lead, with a signed licensing deal to back the claim up. Here's a scene that never made a press release, but people close to the negotiations have described versions of it. Happening at multiple Western automakers around the same 18-month window, almost like the same meeting, repeating itself in different buildings. Picture a conference room somewhere, in Munich, sometime in mid-2025. A group of BMW engineers has spent months building an internal case for continuing to develop driver assistance software. Entirely in-house, the same argument. Cariad's own engineers made to Herbert Diess's 5 years earlier, the same slides, almost the same confident tone. Then someone puts up a slide comparing internal development timelines against what a Chinese partner called was already shipping in production cars on real roads right now, not on a roadmap. The room goes quiet in a very specific, very familiar way. The particular silence of people watching an argument they believed in collapse in real time. Weeks later, BMW signed a partnership with Momenta anyway, to build the intelligent driving system for its next-generation iX3. Launching from BMW's own Shenyang plant in 2026, that same pattern repeated itself separately at General Motors, which committed $300 million to the same company for its. The Chinese lineup, following almost exactly the same internal debate, it repeated at Mercedes-Benz, which is now running its all-new electric CLA on Momenta's driving software while simultaneously launching a Momento-powered robotaxi service in Abu Dhabi. It repeated at Stellantis, which partnered with a different Chinese firm, Pony.ai, to trial robotaxis not in China, but in Europe itself, bringing the technology directly onto the same continent where the resistance to it had started. Industry insiders now casually call BMW Mercedes, and Audi collectively BBA, when discussing this exact trend. Three fierce rivals, companies that compete brutally against each other for every single customer, independently arriving at the identical conclusion within the same narrow window of time. And in the detail that stops people cold every time it comes up. Uber and Momenta are testing level for self-driving cars in Munich itself in 2026. Chinese software on German streets in the city BMW has called home since 1916. So what exactly is Volkswagen licensing? And why couldn't a company with 680,000 employees and 322 billion euros in annual revenue simply build it themselves? The technology is called VLA 2.0 Vision XPeng's second-generation driving model. It's an end-to-end neural system built for Level 4 driving, without relying on pre-built HD maps. The crutch most systems still lean on because mapping every road in advance is slow, expensive, and instantly outdated the moment construction crews show up. XPeng claims a 30 times improvement in how long a car can handle chaotic real-world situations before needing a human to take over a number that, if it holds up in independent testing, represents a genuine generational leap rather than an incremental software patch. Underneath sits what's called China Electronic Architecture, or CEA software fully decoupled from hardware, updating over the air instead of requiring a dealership visit every time something needs fixing. By Volkswagen's own numbers, development cycles cut by up to 40%. System complexity down roughly 30%. The exact efficiency Cariad spent 4 years and billions of euros chasing without ever catching. XPeng, meanwhile, stands to earn an estimated $500 million a year in licensing revenue by 2027, with 20% of Volkswagen's entire Chinese production running on this architecture by that same year. Here's a detail worth sitting with, because it changes how strange this entire relationship actually is. XPeng was founded in 2014 by He Xiaopeng, an entrepreneur who'd previously sold a mobile browser company to Alibaba. At that point, Volkswagen had already been selling cars in China for 3 decades, going back to a joint venture with Shanghai Automotive in 1984, one of the very first Western automakers to enter the Chinese market at all, back when China's own auto industry barely existed in any modern sense. For most of the years between 1984 and roughly 2020, Volkswagen wasn't just successful in China, it was arguably the dominant foreign brand in the country's entire market. The default first car for an entire generation of Chinese families. XPeng didn't deliver its first production car until 2018. Competing against a graveyard of failed Chinese EV startups that mostly collapsed within a few years of launching, that a company barely a decade old, younger than the iPhone, would eventually license software to the automaker that had ruled the Chinese market since before its own founder was old enough to drive, is the kind of reversal that would have sounded like satire if you described it to an auto executive in 2015. It happened anyway in less time than it takes some car platforms to go from sketch to showroom floor. There's one more room worth stepping into before this story wraps up, a room full of people whose entire job is pricing risk. Not feeling nostalgic about who used to copy whom, when Volkswagen's XPeng partnership deepened through the VLA 2.0 licensing announcement in February 2026. Analysts covering both companies had to update their models within days, not months. For XPeng, the calculation was straightforward and genuinely good news. A projected $500 million a year in recurring licensing revenue by 2027 transforms a company that spent most of its history burning cash on hardware into something closer to a high-margin software platform. The exact business model shift that made companies like Qualcomm and ARM enormously valuable long after they stopped manufacturing anything themselves. For Volkswagen, the calculation was murkier and considerably less flattering. Every dollar spent licensing Chinese technology is a dollar that 5 years ago, VW executives promised shareholders would instead build permanent in-house competitive advantage through Cariad. Nobody on that earnings call used the word irony. Analysts don't get paid to editorialize, but the spreadsheet in front of them told the same story this entire piece has been telling, just in a colder, more clinical font. Before this turns into pure inevitability, it deserves a fair counterpoint, because the picture is more complicated than a simple China now controls everything headline suggests. Chinese autonomous driving companies have real specific advantages that don't automatically transfer everywhere the moment a license agreement gets signed. They iterate faster because Chinese regulators approve new software features faster than European or American ones typically do, sometimes by a matter of years rather than months. They collect training data faster because China's dense urban driving generates more edge cases per mile than most Western test fleets encounter in comparable time. And they operate at lower cost, partly because Chinese engineering salaries and EV subsidies remain structurally different from Wolfsburg's cost base, an advantage baked into the broader economy rather than pure technical superiority alone. None of that guarantees Chinese software performs identically in German winters, American highways, or European regulatory environments it wasn't built for from the ground up. Volkswagen's own timeline for Level 3 autonomy in China, starting in the second half of 2027, suggests even VW isn't rushing this into its home market without real validation. First, a notably cautious pace for a company that just made headlines over how aggressively it's embracing Chinese technology. Somewhere in Berlin or Ingolstadt right now, a Cariad engineer who spent 4 years inside the division is reading the same headlines you are, trying to figure out what happens to their own job next, refreshing internal company forums the way people check bank statements during a rough month. Cariad's headcount has fallen from roughly 6,000 toward 4,300, with another 1,600 layoffs announced on top of that reduction. The division's role has been publicly redefined from the company that builds Volkswagen software to the company that integrates software. Volkswagen bought from somebody else a demotion in function even for the employees who keep their jobs through the transition. That engineer doesn't know yet whether their specific team survives the next restructuring round, whether a skill set built around an in-house development philosophy Volkswagen itself has now publicly abandoned in front of international media still has a home inside the company going forward, or whether they'll end up training and maintaining the very Chinese-built systems that effectively replaced the project they spent years building toward a launch date that kept slipping further away. That uncertainty isn't hypothetical or distant. It's playing out in performance reviews and internal reorganization memos this exact month. For real people whose entire careers were built on a strategy the company just admitted publicly on a stage in Munich hadn't worked. So who actually owns the future of driving software? Not steel, is now the most contested part of the entire automotive industry. And Chinese companies currently hold the head start in exactly the category that determines whether a modern car feels advanced to the person sitting behind the wheel, regardless of how impressive the metalwork underneath still is. This isn't one struggling automaker's quick fix to a single embarrassing problem. VW, GM, BMW, Mercedes, and Stellantis all reached the same conclusion within roughly 18 months of each other. Less coincidence, more industry-wide recognition that Chinese software pulled ahead on cost, speed, or both, forcing even bitter corporate rivals into the identical strategic playbook. The direction of technology flow that defined the last 30 years just reversed quietly, without a single headline calling it what it actually was at the time it happened. For decades, Chinese manufacturers studied Western design to catch up, copying silhouettes and grille shapes from cars they couldn't yet match on substance. Now Western manufacturers are licensing Chinese software to catch up themselves. And the money keeps flowing one direction, compounding over time rather than resetting each year. 700 million euros from Volkswagen, $300 million from GM, untold millions more from BMW, Mercedes, and Stellantis to their own respective Chinese partners. Every dollar is R&D spending that could have rebuilt Western in-house capability. Instead, funding the next generation of technology, Western automakers will likely need to license again in another 5 years, widening the gap rather than closing it. 14 billion euros in failed in-house development that made that payment necessary in the first place. 13 times better performance on the exact software. Volkswagen's own engineers spent 4 years failing to build with essentially unlimited resources behind them the whole time. 15 years ago, the joke was that Chinese cars copied Western designs badly, borrowing silhouettes they couldn't yet match on substance. Today, Germany's largest automaker runs Chinese-built AI inside cars wearing its own badge. And it isn't alone. GM, BMW, and Mercedes all made the identical call within the same 18 months. Independently, each one racing to catch up before a rival got there first.